Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Squareo, this television centre and conference centre here at Homo Faber. I'm really pleased to welcome you here. Throughout Homo Faber, here in this room, we've been welcoming artists, designers, makers, thinkers, writers and curators to share their stories and their experiences of what craft means to them. My name's Annie Warburton. I'm Creative Director of the Crafts Council in the United Kingdom. We've been exploring this space that we're going to talk about today on craft in a digital age for around the last decade. The strapline for Homo Faber is crafting a more human future. And at the entrance, you may have seen there's a bold statement from the co-founder Johann Rupert, asserting that Homo Faber celebrates craftsmanship in the face of the rise of machines and artificial intelligence threatening our lives and transforming our jobs. So, are craft and digital in opposition? Well, makers and designers have always been curious about new technologies and have experimented and pushed forward their application. It's several decades since they started to explore those digital technologies, and the first Digital Artisans Manifesto appeared 21 years ago in 1997. There are some examples of digital work here at Homo Faber, but they're few and far between. Elsewhere in Europe, we've got two major international exhibitions on the digital handmade. In Ireland, there's a show as part of Kilkenny Arts Festival, and in France's Centre for Ceramics in Limoges, there's an exhibition on right now called Sans les mains, Without Hands, all about digital fabrication and ceramics. At my own organisation, in the Crafts Council, we first explored this in 2011 in an exhibition called Labcraft, which looked at digital technologies in all different materials. And some of those works then were acquired into our National Collection of Contemporary Craft. So, just as in other creative industries, we've seen digital disrupt and transform music, film, even publishing, we're now seeing the same in the world of craft. It's transforming how things are made, but also where they're made, who makes them, and transforming that connection between the maker and the user. The boundaries between those two are starting to blur because of the technology. In my view, makers bring to bear their embodied knowledge of process and material to transform technology and to make it their own. As Peter Dormer put it, it's not craft as handicraft that defines contemporary craftsmanship. It's craft as knowledge that empowers a maker to take charge of the technology. So, the questions we're going to explore here today are craft and technology really in opposition to each other? Are new technologies simply expanding the toolbox, or are they challenging the very notion of what we mean by craft? And can we actually find some harmony at the intersection between the digital and the analog? Joining us to share their take on this subject are two guests, two experts in their field, author, curator, and innovation consultant Lucy Johnston, and artist and researcher Professor Stephen Hoskins. The format will be, I will introduce each of them in a moment, and they'll each share their perspective on this subject of craft in a digital age. Then we'll join together to kick off a conversation exploring those topics, and I hope we'll be able to open that up to questions from the floor, so please do prepare your questions. So firstly, I'd like to invite Stephen Hoskins to the stage. Professor Hoskins is the Hewlett-Packard Professor of Fine Print and Director for the Centre for Fine Print Research at the University of the West of England in Bristol. He's been a pioneer as an artist and researcher in the field of 3D printing and related technologies for the arts, and in fact holds a patent in one such process. He's also the author of 3D printing for artists, designers, and makers. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Annie. Buongiorno. I'm both an academic and a maker. So everything I will talk about is from the perspective of a creative practitioner, who is also interested in the origins of tools, crafts, and materials. I want to start by showing you that 3D printing, the latest tool in the craftsperson's armory, is not new. In fact, it was invented in 1976 by Charles Hull in the USA, and the first extant machine was produced in 1986, my apologies. I'm just going to show you a short video.
It is now 18 minutes after 8. It seems kind of like magic, but it's called stereolithography. You dream up an idea, plot it out on your computer, and then presto, out comes an exact model. As science editor Michael Gillen tells us, it's revolutionizing American industries.
This computer uses a laser beam to literally create an exact 3D replica of your design.
I think a good way to describe it is to call it a three-dimensional printer.
Charles Hall is the inventor of stereolithography.
In the broadest sense, you might say it does for engineering and manufacturing what the Xerox machine or the word processor, or both of those do for the office environment.
That news bulletin from 1988, just over 20 years ago, apart from the hairstyle, demonstrates where the term 3D printing first came from. The technology has progressed incrementally since then, but is still fundamentally the same. To return to the origins of the process, there are two fundamental processes and two routes to development that you need to keep hold of. The first is the difference between additive and subtractive manufacturing. By additive, we mean adding material, and by subtractive, we mean taking material away. To give you examples, if you turn a chair leg on a lathe, that's taking material away, so subtractive. If you're a sculptor making a head from clay, you keep adding bits of clay to build up the head, so additive. In our history, we will start with subtractive sculpture copying machine of Benjamin Chaverton from 1884. There are a number of early machines from this period, and all work like a three-dimensional pantograph, where a needle passes over the item to be copied, and the replica is carved or drilled from a block of new material. These machines are all forerunners of the CNC milling machines, which we'll get to shortly. The second strand of 3D print's history is the photo sculpture route, here exemplified by the Frenchman François Villem, whose studio was in existence from 1863 to 1868. A series of photographs were taken in the round and then converted to silhouettes. Each silhouette was projected onto a cylindrical block of plaster and carved using a pantograph. This process, again subtractive, was the forerunner of modern 3D printed slicing software. I could follow this thread right through to the 20th century until the advent of 3D printing, but I only have 10 minutes, so you'll have to trust me there is a logical progression of a steadily developing set of processes which did not suddenly burst into existence. To be honest, most people, when they talk about digital 3D technologies, are often referring to a number of technologies and processes. The most ubiquitous is CNC milling. CNC stands for Computer Numeric Control. But put simply, it means digitally controlling a toolpath and is a development of the lathe still used today. CNC is a subtractive process that removes material by cutting it away, as either the cutting tool or the bed rotates at speed. CNC machines now have up to 6 axes, which means that both the cutting tool and the bed can rotate in multiple directions. It is used for everything from most of your car parts to the mould for your plastic sandwich box or your drink bottle. And the little image on the right is the first CNC milled artwork that I could find from 1966. Laser cutting is also very common. A laser is controlled by a vector program and will cut anything from paper and leather to sheet steel. It also has a vast range of uses. Anything from paper and leather to sheet steel. It also has a vast range of uses, from greetings cards that look like lace to wood-burning stoves where the steel is cut by laser and then welded together. It is also used extensively by artists and craftspeople. To move by 3D printing, let us start with the fact that it's not one, but a number of technologies. At the last count, I made it 9, shown here. Most people only see the common and cheapest FDM, fused deposition modelling, which is basically a hot glue gun that follows a digital path. However, there are technologies that cause a photopolymeric material to harden with a laser, the original stereolithography invented by Charles Hull. Laser-sintered nylons and metals, which include gold, titanium, and tungsten. There are powder processes hardened by inkjet ink, and others that use layers of paper. Whilst there's been a great deal of publicity about all these processes, there are only 3 areas I know of where there is real commercial output. Dentistry, for 3D printing the titanium bases for tooth implants. For animation, most famously in the studio of Leica Digital in America, who made box trolls and Kubu and the 2 strings. And finally in hearing aids, where the ear is scanned and a custom earpiece printed. I'm sure there are other examples, but I reiterate, these are the only areas I know where there is significant commercial activity. So, to the future of 3D printing technologies, and 3D printing in particular. Let us first talk about the approach, even before you start, of creating a 3D or digital print. First, you have to think in 3D, which means you have to visualize in your mind the parts of an object you can't see. Then you have to have a material understanding. I always explain this by saying, if you're going to make a shelf using a 3D design CAD computer aided design package, you first have to know what material you're going to make your shelf with and design for it. It is no good to download a generic design shelf and make it from balsa wood if it's intended to withstand a 100-kilogram weight. It is possible to design a shelf in balsa wood that will withstand a 100-kilogram weight, but you need extensive knowledge and understanding of the material to be successful. Not only do you need material understanding, but you need the relevant understanding and expertise of your tool. I often talk about the craft of the digital, which here at Homo Faber, Mann the Maker conference, might seem slight heresy. However, the longer definition of the concept is that human beings are able to control their fate and their environment as the result of the use of tools. I'm fond of quoting, in my opinion, one of the best books on craft ever written, The Wheelwright Shop by George Sturt, first published in 1923. Sturt chronicles the change from the hand-manufactured cart to the coming of mechanized manufacture in his native town of Farnham, between the 1880s and the arrival of the motor car in the earliest 20th century. In terms of handcraft, Sturt talks about material understanding of the timber grown on the left-hand side of the hill because it would lean away from the wind, thus making a better shape for the shape of the cart. Sturt then chronicles the coming of mechanization, which in his opinion and from his perspective took away all of the knowledge of materials and craftsmanship. However, all of the mechanized tools that Sturt described, such as power saws and lathes, planing machine and power drills, are all part of the armory of the modern craftsman in wood. I know of very few craftsmen who would not use powered machinery. Even here at Homo Faber, many of the artifacts on display have used power tools. I want to demonstrate that technology is integral to craft skill. Take the Israeli design duo. That's Sturt's shop. I want to illustrate technology is integral to craft skill. Take the Israeli design duo, Geva Goldner, who created this olive wood and carbon fiber bracelet from a solid block of wood. First, the backside of the olive wood is CNC milled into the solid block of wood, then laid up with carbon fiber and polished to a finish. And finally, the outside face of the olive wood is milled from the remainder of the wood. Without a complete understanding of materials and process, this would never have been possible. Or the Paleolith watch, designed by Marianne Forrest, a well-known UK clockmaker, made from laser-sintered 3D printed stainless steel. This watch took 6 months of filing, polishing, and soldering, I've gone the wrong way, to create the one watch. Just one watch and 6 months of cleaning. But she would not have made it without 3D printing. Both of these examples are of Homo Faber at its best. Human beings being able to control their fate and their environment as a result of the use of tools, to quote one definition of Homo Faber. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. There was a great insight there. I think we'll pick up that conversation on whether it's a heretical insight in terms of craft of the digital when we sit down. But for now, I would like to introduce Lucy Johnston. Lucy's a writer, a curator, and an innovation consultant. I first came across Lucy when her book, Digital Handmade, Craftsmanship in the New Industrial Revolution, was published a few years ago. It's now in its second edition. It's the first global survey of designers and makers reinventing artisanship in a digital era. It profiles 80 of those makers, and I think we're going to hear just a few of them today. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie, and thank you to the Michelangelo Foundation for the invitation. Such a pleasure to be here. As Annie said, I'm author of Digital Handmade, which is this book here. So I'll be talking today just about 7 of the artisans that I've celebrated in the book. And as Annie said, there are 80 in the book, so please do come and have a look at the full collection afterwards. I'll pop it here. When I started out on the research, I didn't realize what an amazing journey it was going to be. I knew there were fascinating makers and artisans out there who were really challenging the understanding of digital technologies, but until I got involved in writing the book and interviewing all these people, I hadn't realized what an absolutely incredible industry is forming, this new movement of digital artisans. I started with 400 possible artisans to go in the book, so I had to cut it right down. It was very difficult. So I always like to start with a quote by Herbert Reed, really to show that the conversation between artists and designers and new technologies is not a new one. So this is Herbert Reed back in 1934, talking about how we should look at machine tools or technological tools versus the tools of the hand. So it's a conversation, it's a discussion that's been going on ever since, but I always come back to this just to remind myself, just to get some perspective on the conversation. I always also like to start by talking a little bit about this beautiful vase. I don't know if anybody knows what that is. It's the Wedgwood version of the Portland vase, or the Barberini vase, which is in the British Museum in London. Just a little bit of background on the Portland vase. In 1845, a rather drunk, stout gentleman tottered into the British Museum, and he made a headway for this beautiful vase, well, not this one, the original Portland vase, 2,000-year-old Greek glass vase. He picked it up and he dropped it deliberately on the floor, where it shattered into about 289 pieces. So he wrecked it, basically. And his only excuse was he'd had a little bit too much to drink. So yeah, baffling. Anyway, the curators and the restorers at the British Museum were able to piece back that absolutely priceless vase because they had this vase created by Josiah Wedgwood to use as a reference point. Now, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Wedgwood was looking at this vase and wanted to, he took it as the ultimate challenge for an artisan, for a craftsman in that era. Could he recreate this original Portland vase? And he did do, in the end, but he called it an almost insurmountable challenge. And in his own words, he said that he threw every technology of the day at the problem, at the challenge to solve it. So again, I like to reference that because they were talking about technology back in the 1700s, early 1800s, technology really being the tools that we use to make beautiful objects, to make those objects that we have in our mind that we want to bring to life. So in my book, I argue very strongly that digital technologies are tools, just like every other tool that a craftsman has ever used, and they're there to enable craftsmen to challenge their materials, to challenge what's possible to be made by hand, by humans, using digital technologies, simply to help them with that path. New Industrial Revolution versus original Industrial Revolution. So this is a lovely picture just showing the original Industrial Revolution, late 1700s. You see here the huge monsters of machines. So this was the first time that humans in the world of craft and design and artisanship had come face to face with this kind of mechanized production. And in this particular picture, I always pull it out because the humans are dwarfed in this relationship. Huge machines, tiny people. Fast forward to now, so we're now in the new industrial revolution, or the fourth industrial revolution, which way you want to look at it. And our machines, our monster machines, as they were seen back then, are tiny. They're this size. So the relationship between humans and machines, that relationship of control, of flexibility, of understanding has changed as well. So, going to fly through 7 case studies. I'm going to be very quick, and I know Annie's going to wave when I'm out of time because I get a little carried away. But I'll tell you some quick stories of 7 of the artisans just to show you how they're tackling this discussion, how they're bringing both mastercraft tools and digital tools into their work. So I'm sure you'll know the work of Michael Eden. He was a craft potter in the UK for over 20 years before he discovered 3D printing, and that has completely revolutionized his work. He now works solely using 3D printing to create forms, to create vases and sculptures that defy gravity, that defy analog processes. These are, in his own words, these are pieces that he'd always dreamed of but could never have actually made if it wasn't for the assistance of digital tools. So here you're seeing laser-sintered vases, which have been hand-finished with a non-fired ceramic coating. So the texture at the end is, it's very beautiful, it's very compelling, and it doesn't look 3D printed, which is, I think, possibly a topic we'll move on to later, the idea of if there's an aesthetic around digital tools. And in Michael's case, there certainly isn't. The sky's the limit in terms of the structures that he's able to create. Similarly, Amy Roper-Lyons in the US, she is fascinated by the ancient craft of pliqué à jour, used by Lalique and many glassmakers, but not seen so much anymore. And she was looking for a way that she could bring back that technique, kind of modernize it, and really challenge what it's possible to create using that technique. So she discovered laser sintering, again, but firstly, laser sintering with nylon, and then using a traditional rubber mold, but more recently, as Stephen was touching on, laser sintering in metals. So she's now experimenting in printing those beautiful vessels from titanium powder in the laser sintering process without needing a mold at all. And the structures are so unbelievably refined. It's a really beautiful example of how digital technology doesn't need to appear digital. It enables artisans to create something exquisitely beautiful, exquisitely detailed, that may not have been possible to that level purely by hand. Isé Bloch is a very fascinating designer. He works on everything from architecture to fashion to homewares. He has a very structural approach, and he's inspired by the biomimetics of natural form. So here you're seeing one of his cutlery ranges, and I put this in as an example because I wanted to show how, in many cases, digital technologies enable the impossible to be made possible. So similar to Michael Eden. Similar to Amy Roper-Lyons, but here this is even more extreme. So if you look at the handles of this cutlery, he created this using 3D printed wax and then the lost wax method to finally cast in gold and silver, cast in silver and gold-plated brass. And if you look very closely at the handles, I think you might have to look more closely in the book, and if you imagine trying to make that by hand, you quickly come to the conclusion that it would not be possible because he's shaping out the inside of the handles as much as he's shaping the outside, and you just couldn't, with your hand and analog tools, you just couldn't get those angles. So again, a lovely example of making the impossible possible. Geoffrey Mann is a very interesting sculptor up in Scotland. In fact, this piece is in the Crafts Council collection, I believe. So here, Geoffrey, again, he's used 3D printing techniques to create the mold for his final metallic piece, but he's also bringing in other digital technologies. So in this case, he's using a 3D planar scanner. He started with a beautiful traditional candelabra, shone bright lights on it, and then used the planar scanner to scan the reflections, to scan those beautiful shards of light which were being reflected by the candelabra, and that's his final sculpture. His final sculpture is not a copy of the candelabra. His final sculpture is making tangible the intangible, so he has created form from the light bouncing off the surface, and he could literally only do that using 3D technologies. So a lovely example of how those kind of digital tools help us to make tangible something that could not previously be modeled. Similarly, Guto Requena in Brazil, He works with sound, so audio waves combined with sculpture. So on the left-hand side, he's created, this is a 3D printed chair, which he disrupted in the CAD model by exposing it to the sounds, recorded sounds from his city around him, so the city of Sao Paulo. So in the jagged disruption of that chair, you're seeing the traffic noise and the hustle and bustle of people and the sirens and general noise of the street. And on the right-hand side, he's created these beautiful beautiful molds for glass, again using 3D printing to create the molds, but disrupting the surface of the mold with the sound wave of his grandmother reading his favorite children's stories. I have this one at home. It's the Owl and the Pussycat poem. And if you turn the vase sideways, you get an idea of the lilting of his grandmother's voice as she reads it. So again, that would be impossible without digital tools to help us see what we couldn't see before and make that physically tangible and tactile. Excuse me. Moving on to CNC milling, which Stephen touched on earlier. This is using 5-axis CNC milling. As you can see, it's a beautiful table. It's called the Cinderella table, made in 57 slices. So Jerome started by taking, months at a computer for a start. So that's another argument for digital technologies not being a way of cutting corners or speeding up or cheating on the process. There are months of work involved working with software before you can even make these things tangible. So he started with the 2-dimensional profile outline of 2 traditional commodes, sideboard pieces from the Louvre in Paris. And he morphed one 2-dimensional facade, you see on the left, through to a 2-dimensional facade on the right-hand side. And in between, he sculpted this beautiful morphing effect between the 2 shapes. In CAD, he then sliced that into 57 pieces and milled each slice out of plywood in 5-axis, and then very carefully slotted them together to create the final form. Now that, if you imagine hand sculpting that, it would just about be possible if you gave it a few years, but there are certain angles and there are certain details that, again, the human hand just couldn't reach. It couldn't get that perfect angle. And then finally, am I okay for time? Good, one more, there we are, not too bad. I wanted to bring in an example of textiles, a different part of the craft portfolio. Nadia Ann has started a wonderful company in London called Beatwoven. She makes tangible the essence of music, ultimately. So she created a piece of software which can analyze any piece of music, from a pop song to a classical piece. And that software analyzes the piece of music. It picks up on the rhythm and the tone and the lyrical line, and the speed and the tempo and so on. And it translates that into a mathematical pattern, because ultimately music is mathematics underneath. So she has made that visible in terms of creating a pattern. She then spends months, again, using software is not cheating in any way, not speeding up the process, because she takes months then working on screen to allocate individual threads, different materials, to represent every single pixel in that pattern. And she then sends that to a jacquard loom and stands over it as that's woven in front of her eyes. So she's very much part of the process the whole way through. And at no stage does she cut any corners through digital technologies. And she ends up with these absolutely beautiful fabrics that have captured these unique patterns that you see in music. Well, you don't see in music until now. She allows us to see what we couldn't see before. And just to finish, again, another quote I like to draw on. So this was the Design Research Unit back in the 1970s, early 1970s, late 1960s, really championing the idea at the time that the worlds of art and industry were starting to separate. They were going off on tangents and were becoming, they were ignoring each other, basically. They were both charging down a path of success and heroics and bravery, and were forgetting the essence of the other part of the story. So even back in the 60s, 70s, they were championing this idea that those two paths need to come back together, because that's when we really create new culture, we create new beautiful, new beauty in the world that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So that's my argument on the topic. Thank you.
Thanks. Are we Thanks so much, Lucy. I was really struck actually by that last quote and reminded that when the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which we think of as, certainly the UK's preeminent museum of design and craft, its purpose was expressly to bring together, as you say, art and industry. So if we even go back to the 19th century, there was this drive to say this is a bit of a false dichotomy between the two. And really that's where I'd like to start with this conversation, because you've both made, I think, a very strong case to say that actually these two things come together, that digital technologies are simply another kind of tool. And I want to draw into that conversation, how does that affect our definitions of what craft is? Can craft be anything now? Richard Sennett talks about the craft of code, for example. I don't know, Lucy, you're nodding, so do you want to pick up on that? Where are the edges of craft? If digital can be craft, where does craft stop?
Yeah, it's an interesting, rather confusing conversation to have. I've talked about it a lot recently. It's the same with the word curation, okay, so it's an overused term. But I think, really, that craft will always be the mastery of a material, the understanding, as Stephen was talking about earlier, understanding the material and understanding how far you can push that material to create new culture, to create new statements of beauty, using whatever tools are at your disposal. But I think it's about mastering the tools, understanding the material, but also about innovation as well. We live in a world where we're hungry for new. We love new ideas. We love new versions of beauty, new stories of beauty. And so I think craft also has a very strong role to play in that sense, that it needs to challenge, reinvention, new invention, and just creating things, defying gravity, creating something new.
Stephen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I too have thought about this lots, and I suppose my view upon it is that it's the material. So we live in a physical world. No matter how much the world is deemed to be digital, 98 or 99% of the room is physical, tangible, and we actually sit in a chair and have a table. So for me, craft is still the physical manifestation. The digital is just the means to get there. And I think people forget the means. And you have to master your means to be able to create your final object. And I think it's as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so I'd quite like to unpack that a bit further, thank you. I often think about David Pye, who talked about the workmanship of risk and the workmanship of certainty. He was a major craft theorist. He never used the word craft. He preferred this word workmanship. And what he meant by this distinction between workmanship of risk and workmanship of certainty was that risk was about what we're talking about here, craft, right? Judgment, care, dexterity, the knowledge of the material and the process, the tacit knowledge, the intelligence of the hand. And he contrasted that with the predictable results of machine making, the workmanship of certainty. So that was how he conceived it. I'm curious, we've touched on this a bit, but what does a craft mindset bring to these digital technologies? Can anyone use a CNC mill? Stephen?
No, I don't think you can. You have to learn those things. I think the two things. I think we are in the start of that fourth age. But I think there are two things. A lot of the work we're now moving into as a research centre is how to bring analog attitudes back to the digital. So very much one needs to return to understanding the traditional process of doing something before you then enter the digital. I still don't think you can materially make something unless you understand its history and its fundamentals. So I think that's never going to change, no matter what digital tool you use. And you certainly can't just press a button. I mean, for 3D printing, you need still 4 bits of software before you get anywhere, and you've got to learn them all. And then you've still got to understand what your material does when you print. So, no.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned very briefly in part of my slides that there is this preconceived notion that technologies, digital technologies or any technologies, are a way of speeding up processes or cutting corners, which is absolutely not the case. All of the artisans I showed, even though they were using software and CAD and then the various 3D printing techniques, that was months and months of work. So it's not a choice that craftsmen make in order to speed up the making of their ideas. In many ways, it slows them down because there's so much new to learn, and we're at the very beginning of really understanding the potential. So I think in terms of going back to your question about the relationship of the craftsman and the machines, or how we see the both, I think that craft, at the center of craft, is very much a curiosity as well, which is missing from the industrial use of those machines. So I think when a craftsman approaches a 3D printer, he's approaching it with a different attitude, and I think that's what's so exciting, and that's where the predictability goes out the window, because the craftsman will challenge what that machine can do, rather than the industrialists who know what the machine can do and therefore do that with the machine. Mm-hmm. The craftsman will be like, well, yeah, I know it can do that, but I've been wanting to do this, so can it help me do this? So I think the inherent curiosity of a craftsman is what makes it so exciting and makes it, yes, not predictable.
Okay. So flipping that question on its head, we talked about what craft mindset brings to working with digital technologies. But what do digital technologies bring to the crafted object? I think one of the things people often value in crafted works is what we might call the aura, the sense of the investment of time, which you've just spoken about, but also the human touch, and that thought and emotion that goes into an object. Now, some of these objects bring together the handmade and the digital, but in some of them, a hand hasn't gone anywhere near them. And I'm thinking of Thomas Libertini's vase that's in the library here. Now, that was crafted by bees, not by him. And then he 3D printed the honeycomb form. So he came up with the idea, but it doesn't have that human aura and touch. So do digital technologies diminish the very thing we love about handmade works? As an artist, Stephen, what's your perspective on that?
I was just trying to think of that through. I think it depends how you talk about touch. A lot of craft, wood is one I return to constantly because it's easier to talk about. If you turn a wooden bowl on the lathe, you don't touch it. You turn it, you polish it, but you don't necessarily physically touch it from start to finish. You do if you sculpt something, but that's just a different feeling. My background in printing is always something that's one step removed from what you do. In fact, I like screen printing because I physically touch the screen and push the ink through, and I don't like etching because it's removed and it goes into the acid. So I don't think digital just makes any difference to that. Those things are, either it's a process that's part of you or it isn't. And that doesn't make any difference to craft. Sorry, I'm not explaining myself very well.
You did it very well. Lucy, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think, so going back to the notion of curiosity, I think also what the craftsman is bringing to the making of an object using digital technologies is the care, like the utmost care and attention to detail. So although maybe you don't see the mark of the maker in the same way, if a craftsman is truly pushing those technologies as far as they can, there's an incredible amount of dedication and time, as we talked about earlier, but care and attention to detail that goes into that. As Stephen said, it's you have to do your hours learning about how to use these tools. So I absolutely understand the argument for the imperfect in craft as well, being able to see those little marks of the maker, the wabi-sabi Japanese, the beauty and imperfection idea, absolutely. But I do think that although digitally made objects like the beautiful vase you mentioned haven't actually encountered a physical human hand in their making, there's still the passion and the dedication of a craftsman behind that piece. And at the end of the day, he still thought that concept into being, and made it happen. So he still set himself a challenge and created it. which I find very compelling, even if I can't see his fingerprints in it, or the odd little defect. Or
So the idea and the care and the material understanding is still coming through.
Yeah.
Does anyone? I have some more questions, but I was just wondering whether there are any questions out there in the audience. Do you want to wave a hand? Yes, someone here in the second row. I think someone is dashing towards you right now with a microphone, so we can pick you up on the recording. Please go ahead.
And thank you for very interesting presentations. As well as kind of, what does digital or crafted how does that have an impact on the object? I'm curious about how does it have an impact on the maker. So I've worked in architecture and animation, and I know that it's very different if you're making something by hand or if you're spending hours and hours working on the computer. And so I wondered if in your work and research you've touched on that at all.
Stephen.
Yeah, I think it's neither one nor the other necessarily in most cases. I'm currently making some 2-meter kites for a well-known British photographer called Liz Hingley. And we've 3D printed all the joints. It's made of carbon fiber, but then the images are digitally printed onto handmade Japanese paper, and it's held together with probably about 600 knots. So it isn't one or the other necessarily. I think, I would tend to use digital technologies where necessary, and hand skills, you can't tie a knot by machine easily, where that's necessary, and Japanese paper happens to mold particularly well. I think people are assuming that it's one thing or the other, and photography is a prime example now that nobody prints images on gelatine photography much apart from very expensive photographer, because the gelatine film is not available. You just print them out digitally and nobody takes any notice. So I think, we're slowly going through this stuff rather than quickly going through it, and it's just becoming part of what we do. I think in another 100 years there'll be other technologies, and we'll look back at this as handcrafting, as Sturt did, separate from the shop. I think it's relative to the time you're in. Sorry.
It's another turn of the wheelwright's wheel. Any other questions from the floor? No. Oh, yes, one just there. Again, the mic is on its way to you.
Hi. First of all, I would like to, say that whoever says that digital work is actually quicker and easier, confronted with handcrafts, has never spent 1,000 of hours in front of a computer, 3D modeling. The question I have is about error and mistakes. Even in some of the objects that were shown, there was this sort of aesthetics of small bumps and imperfection that obviously are making, they're trying to reproduce the errors that a human hand usually produces. Isn't this a sort of kind of being ashamed of the true potential of digital modeling system and ambience that actually is not fully explored, and so has to sort of bring back the aura that you were referring to beforehand?
Thank you. Lucy, I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. Are we afraid of perfection? Is it that kind of uncanny valley fear that we have?
It's a really interesting question, thank you. I think, I think the idea of digital technologies creating everything to be completely perfect is not necessarily the case. There are plenty of glitches and mistakes that are made using digital technologies, and then when you come to actually create the physical object, there are going to be glitches and mistakes and little details. Interesting that you talk, and I think that's part of what's so exciting about it actually, is that it's a constant work in progress. We're just figuring this out all the time. In terms of mimicking human error, I'm not sure I've seen that much. I suppose where I have seen the mimicking of human error is where an artisan is started by possibly 3D scanning an existing object to then play with and disrupt using digital technologies. But I haven't personally seen that many who are trying to copy the aesthetic of the the handcraft. I certainly wouldn't say that they would be ashamed of a perfect piece in digital, because I think we need to judge them in different, using different criteria to a certain extent. And there is beauty in perfection, like there's beauty in imperfection. But I don't think that digital objects are perfect, actually, because, as Stephen was saying earlier, we're so early in the process of understanding what we can do that everything's an experiment, everything's a work in progress. We see a lot at the moment, a lot of vases and chairs, for example, because those are recognizable objects that a digital artisan can challenge the form of and the shape of and the making of, while still creating a piece that we recognize and that we can then compare with what we would know. So there's a lot of imperfection there in the experiment. I'm just talking myself around in a circle. It's brilliant. It's a really good question. I could discuss all afternoon.
I'm going to draw you into the conversation, Stephen, because and I want to broaden it out a little as well, and think about that aesthetics of the digitally made. I think around 5-6 years ago, there was a very distinctive and, frankly, to my eye, quite tiresome aesthetic. We seem to be shedding that, but I'm interested in your take on the aesthetics.
I think we are. I don't think we've got far enough yet. Certainly, we could look at people and not that, like nervous systems and those people who did have that aesthetic of growing mathematically a shape. One of the things that I've been challenging recently is, does digital have to be accurate? In the sense that we've been doing quite a lot of work on signatures. Whenever you write a signature, it's never the same, but there are points that are common in your signature. So it's just as easy to program your machine to take those points and then randomly fill in the spaces. And there's work beginning to happen in robotics and those areas of increasing, not randomness, but other ways of measuring which aren't necessarily accurate, which I think answers the question. So I think we've moved away from a particular aesthetic into a newer aesthetic, but I don't think we've got there, is the simple answer. I think it's a work in progress.
Thank you. Time for one last question. Anyone? Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen, for mentioning robotics, because, of course, you've been talking a lot about 3D printing, but there are many other digital techs that are coming into play. My guess is that it's quite obvious that we should consider digital tools just a part of the toolbox. But then there is a point where digital tools become kind of almost autonomous, even in the creation. For example, we keep saying, creativity is the human side, and touch is the human side, and caring is the human side, and machines will never get there. But the reality is that there is a thing like generative artificial intelligence, for example, where the machine scans millions of artifacts that are considered beautiful, aesthetically pleasant, etc. And out of that creates, quote unquote, the next artifact. And so the process of creation becomes automatic as well. And then you can feed it into a 3D printer, and the whole process becomes made by machines. So I think the next challenge is actually, how do we define the real confines of what's craft and what's not craft when confronted with a potential for a completely automatic process from creation to object?
Okay, that's a huge question to wrap up on. I'm going to give you a moment to think about it and just offer something myself, which is from a friend of mine who's a professor of mathematics at Imperial College London. He specialises in a bit of maths that a couple of people in the world understand. And he's been talking to me about craft, and he said, can we talk about the craft of a mathematical proof? What Kevin says is that, you can ask a computer or an artificial intelligence to as you're saying, to do multiple calculations or deal with data. But what that computer can't do is construct a mathematical proof. And what it can try, but it doesn't have what the mathematicians are looking for, which is elegance in that proof. So on that, I'll just ask Stephen or Lucy if there's anything you'd like to add.
Okay, and back to an analogy, I think, to answer your question. Your mobile phone at the moment, you take your picture, and what you're taking is not what you took with an analog camera. What you're taking with your phone is a series of software decisions that have been made by somebody else. There's a particular element in your camera called Retinex, which works quite well in this room here. If you take a photograph and try and get the room interior and the view outside, the camera will automatically balance it up for you. We don't take any notice of it. You just assume your camera does it. It doesn't make a good photograph. The photograph is your choice and your decision, and a good photographer who's done his 10,000 hours will take a much better photograph than we will by just pointing it. So that's my answer to your question, is that the technology will come along, but it will still be the decision of a human as to what's aesthetically pleasing or not.
Yeah, and I would just add to that what I was saying earlier about curiosity. So machines are not curious. Okay, they don't. You can program an AI to explore different combinations and analyze a lot of data and say, okay, so this and this have never been joined together before. Let's try, you know. But it's not curiosity, and it's not an understanding as such of the technologies or the pieces that it's recognizing or the materials. So I think that has got to remain in terms of our understanding of craft in a world of robotics and AI, that humans are the only machines. We have, you know, incredible mechanics and technology going on inside our brains, that humans will bring that unique curiosity, that unique way of experimenting, that unique understanding. So I can't stand the idea of an AI creating a piece of art because it's analysed 1,000 other pieces of art and reckons that this will be the next big seller. It's happening, of course it is, and it's fascinating to see the process. I've spent quite a lot of time with companies that are doing that, but that doesn't give it the emotional value that is what we, you know, find so precious in our experiences of craft and beautiful objects. So I think I get very passionate about this. I could talk about robotics for a long time. I feel quite sorry for robots, actually, in a way, you know, because they're absolutely brilliant in terms of what they're enabling us to do. And we just need to retain our power in that, our curiosity and our ability to just push things further.
Okay, so thank you both. By way of wrapping up, keep curious, do your 10,000 hours, know your skill, know your material, and keep passionate. I'd like to say thank you to the Michelangelo Foundation for putting on this extraordinary event and celebration of craftsmanship in all of its guises. A special thank you to Muriel Prouet of the Institut National des Métiers d'Art and your colleagues, who has programmed this series of talks. Thank you so much. And of course, a big thank you to our excellent speakers, Professor Stephen Hoskins and Lucy Johnston. Thank you.